The first contact happened on a cold, wind-swept plateau in the northernmost reaches of Earth. It wasn't what humanity had imagined for centuries, a grand spectacle of lights and roaring engines descending from the heavens, but something quieter, almost intimate. A ship, sleek and silver like liquid mercury frozen mid-flow, materialized without warning one evening as snowflakes danced around its edges. Its presence radiated an aura that defied logic. It seemed alive, pulsating faintly with an inner light that shifted hues unpredictably. Humanity's response was chaotic at best. Governments scrambled to deploy military forces while scientists begged for calm, insisting this moment required diplomacy over aggression. The world watched through screens and whispers, torn between awe and fear. But amid the chaos stood Elias, a linguist who had spent his life studying ancient languages and forgotten scripts. He wasn't chosen by rank or reputation but by sheer coincidence. He happened to be nearby when the craft arrived, working on a project unrelated to extraterrestrial life. When officials realized they needed someone fluent in decoding patterns beyond human comprehension, Elias found himself thrust into the role of ambassador. As he approached the vessel alone, wearing nothing more than a parka and determination, Elias felt the weight of billions pressing against his chest. The air crackled with energy, each step forward pulling him deeper into uncertainty. No one knew if the beings inside were benevolent or hostile, curious or indifferent. Yet there was no turning back now. As the ship's surface rippled like water disturbed by a stone, a figure emerged, not through a door, but seemingly carved out of the shimmering metal itself. She was unlike anything Elias could have prepared for. Towering yet graceful, her form suggested both fragility and immense power. Her skin shimmered like opalescent crystal, refracting light into colors that didn't exist in nature. Long limbs moved with fluid precision, every gesture deliberate yet effortless. Most striking were her eyes, vast, luminous orbs that seemed to hold galaxies within them. They glowed softly, shifting between shades of violet and gold, drawing him in despite the absurdity of the situation. Elias froze, momentarily forgetting why he was there. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him feel both insignificant and profoundly seen. Around them, the wind howled, but here, in this bubble of surreal stillness, time seemed irrelevant. For all his training, Elias couldn't find words, only wonder. And then she spoke, not with sound but directly into his mind, a voice that resonated like distant stars humming their secrets. "You are unexpected," she said, her tone layered with curiosity and something else he couldn't quite place. Elias swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. "We've been waiting for you," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. But even as he spoke, his gaze lingered on those otherworldly eyes, captivated by their depth. In that instant, he realized this encounter would change everything, not just for humanity, but perhaps for her too. The alien queen regarded Elias with a mixture of intrigue and caution, her movements deliberate yet imbued with an elegance that transcended mere physicality. Each step she took seemed to ripple outward, affecting the very fabric of space around her, as though reality bent slightly to accommodate her presence. Her crystalline form shimmered under the dim light of the polar sky, casting prismatic reflections onto the snow-covered ground. Despite her imposing stature, there was an undeniable grace about her, a quiet confidence that commanded respect without demanding it. Elias found himself struggling to reconcile his academic training with the visceral impact of her presence. His years of studying dead languages and deciphering cryptic symbols had prepared him for complexity, but nothing could have readied him for the emotional weight of standing face-to-face with an entity so utterly alien. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain composure, to treat this as another puzzle to solve, yet his heart raced uncontrollably. "You are fragile," she observed, tilting her head again, this time with what might have been concern, or perhaps amusement. Her mental voice carried nuances impossible to convey through spoken language, each word layered with meaning that resonated deep within him. Fragile, yet bold. Her words struck a chord, stirring emotions he hadn't anticipated. Bold. He certainly didn't feel bold. If anything, he felt exposed, vulnerable in ways he'd never experienced before. Yet, paradoxically, her acknowledgement of his audacity filled him with a strange sense of validation. Here he was, representing an entire species known for its flaws and fears, and somehow she saw strength in him. "I suppose we are," Elias admitted, his voice softer now, tinged with humility. But isn't bravery often born out of fragility? She paused, considering his response. Her vast eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to peer past his words and into the essence of who he truly was. For a moment, the connection between them felt almost tangible, as though their minds brushed against one another in some ethereal plane. Then, unexpectedly, her expression softened, an imperceptible shift, but one that sent a shiver down his spine. "You carry burdens," she said finally, her tone shifting to something warmer, almost compassionate. "I see them in your eyes. They weigh heavily upon you." Elias blinked, caught off guard by her perceptiveness. How could she possibly know? And yet, somehow, she did. It was as if her luminous gaze pierced through layers of pretense and self-protection, revealing truths he'd buried long ago. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. Words felt inadequate in the face of such profound insight. Instead, he opted for honesty. "We all carry burdens," he said simply. "It's part of being human. But sometimes beauty can be found even amidst the weight." Her reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Her posture relaxed ever so slightly, and the glow of her eyes dimmed, becoming gentler, more inviting. It was as though his admission had disarmed her in some way, lowering the invisible barriers she'd erected between them. For the first time since their meeting, Elias sensed vulnerability in her, not weakness, but a willingness to engage on a deeper level. "You speak of beauty," she murmured, her voice tinged with curiosity. "What is beauty to your kind?" The question caught him off guard. Beauty. It was such a subjective concept, one shaped by culture, experience, and emotion. How could he possibly explain it to someone whose existence likely operated on entirely different principles? "It's difficult to define," he began hesitantly. "Beauty is fleeting, ephemeral. It exists in moments, in sunlight breaking through clouds, in music that stirs the soul, in acts of kindness that defy reason. But most importantly," he hesitated, searching for the right words, "beauty is connection. It's seeing something, or someone, and feeling moved by it, changed by it." As he spoke, his gaze drifted unconsciously back to her eyes. Those mesmerizing pools of light seemed to pulse gently, reflecting his words, or perhaps responding to them. The realization hit him suddenly. She wasn't just listening to him, she was experiencing him. Every syllable, every nuance of emotion behind his speech, resonated within her in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. "And what do you see when you look at me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though it reverberated powerfully in his mind. There was a vulnerability in her question, a raw openness that startled him. She wasn't merely asking for information, she was seeking understanding, perhaps even acceptance. Elias took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was uncharted territory, not just for him, but for both of them. What he said next would matter more than anything else he'd ever uttered in his life. "I see beauty," he replied, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. "Your eyes, they're beautiful. Not because of how they look, but because of what they reveal. Strength, wisdom, and something else. Something I can't quite name." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Then, slowly, her luminous eyes widened, and a soft, almost imperceptible hum emanated from her form. It was a sound unlike any he'd ever heard, melodic yet haunting, carrying undertones of surprise and something else he couldn't identify. Shyness? Could an alien queen, commanding and enigmatic, feel shy? Her reaction left Elias speechless. Never in his wildest imaginings had he expected such a response. She lowered her gaze briefly, the movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed had he not been watching her so intently. The prismatic glow of her skin dimmed slightly, as if she were retreating inward, shielding herself from his words, or perhaps absorbing them. When she finally looked up again, there was a newfound softness in her demeanor, a vulnerability that seemed incongruous with her regal bearing. Her lips parted, though they weren't lips in the traditional sense, more like translucent ripples along her crystalline features, and a low, melodic vibration filled the air. It wasn't language, not in any form he recognized, but it carried an unmistakable emotion: gratitude. "You honor me," she said after a pause, her mental voice laced with a warmth that made his chest tighten. "No one has ever spoken to me thus." Elias felt a flush creep up his neck, an involuntary human reaction to embarrassment or admiration. He hadn't intended to fluster her, or perhaps himself, but the sincerity of his words had clearly struck a chord. It occurred to him then that her beauty wasn't just external, it emanated from within, a reflection of her essence. And yet, she seemed unfamiliar with the concept of being admired, as though her role as queen had placed her beyond such personal connections. "I meant what I said," he replied softly, his voice trembling slightly. "You don't need to hide from it." Her luminous eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw uncertainty there, a flicker of doubt, quickly masked by resolve. She straightened, her posture regaining some of its earlier authority, though the warmth remained. "Among my kind," she began, her tone measured yet tinged with melancholy, "such sentiments are rare. We value strength, logic, purpose. To acknowledge beauty, to allow oneself to be seen, is perilous." Perilous. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Elias understood instinctively that she wasn't speaking of physical danger but something deeper, more existential. Perhaps among her people, vulnerability equated to weakness, and weakness was something no ruler could afford. Yet here she was, standing before him, allowing herself to be vulnerable, if only for a fleeting moment. "Why perilous?" he asked gently, taking a cautious step closer. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the sound jarring in the otherwise ethereal silence. Surely, even queens deserve to be seen, not just as rulers, but as individuals. Her gaze sharpened, piercing through him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "To be seen is to risk being judged," she said, her voice carrying a weight that suggested centuries of experience. "And judgment leads to division. My people look to me for unity, for certainty. To show them anything less would fracture the harmony we've built." Elias nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He understood the burden of leadership, though on a far smaller scale. As a scholar, he'd often felt the pressure to appear infallible, to mask his doubts behind a veneer of expertise. But where he had peers to confide in, she seemed utterly alone in her position. The thought tugged at something deep within him, a pang of empathy he couldn't suppress. "But isn't harmony also built on trust?" he ventured carefully. "If your people can't see you as you truly are, how can they trust you completely?" Her expression shifted, a ripple of light dancing across her crystalline features. It was as though his question had stirred something dormant within her, a seed of doubt, or perhaps hope, that she hadn't allowed herself to entertain before. She didn't answer immediately, instead gazing past him toward the horizon, where the auroras painted the night sky in vibrant hues. "I have never considered it thus," she admitted finally, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Perhaps you are wiser than I believed." The compliment caught him off guard, eliciting a nervous laugh. "Hardly wise," he countered, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "Just human. We tend to overthink things, especially when it comes to matters of the heart." At that, she turned back to him, her eyes glowing brighter, almost playfully. "The heart," she repeated, testing the word as though it were foreign to her. "You place great importance on it, do you not?" "It's complicated," he admitted with a sheepish grin. "Sometimes it guides us well, other times it gets us into trouble. But without it, I think we'd lose something essential about ourselves." Her gaze lingered on him, thoughtful and probing. For a moment, he wondered if she was dissecting his words, analyzing them for hidden meanings. But then she smiled, not with her translucent features, but with her eyes, which sparkled with a warmth that made his own heart skip a beat. "Perhaps," she said softly, "there is wisdom in simplicity." Before Elias could respond, a sudden shift in the atmosphere drew their attention. The shimmering surface of her ship pulsed faintly, casting rippling shadows across the snow. A low hum emanated from the craft, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't threatening, but it was insistent, demanding acknowledgement. "My people call," she said, her tone shifting back to one of duty. Yet there was a lingering softness in her voice, a trace of the connection they'd forged. "I must return." Elias nodded, though a pang of regret tightened his chest. Their conversation had barely scratched the surface, yet it felt monumental, as though they'd bridged a chasm wider than the stars themselves. He wanted to ask more questions, to delve deeper into her thoughts and experiences, but he knew better than to delay her departure. "Will you come back?" he asked impulsively, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. She hesitated, her luminous eyes locking onto his with an intensity that stole his breath. "Perhaps," she replied cryptically. "But know this, human man, your words will stay with me long after I leave this place." With that, she turned and began moving toward her ship, her steps fluid and graceful. As she reached the edge of the craft, the metallic surface dissolved around her, enveloping her in a cascade of light. Within moments, she was gone, leaving Elias standing alone on the plateau, the echoes of her presence lingering in the frigid air. He stared at the spot where she had vanished, his mind racing with possibilities. What had just transpired between them? Was it merely a fleeting exchange, or the beginning of something greater? One thing was certain: her eyes, their beauty, their mystery, would haunt him forever. In the days that followed, the world buzzed with speculation and analysis. News outlets dissected every detail of the encounter, experts debated its implications, and governments scrambled to prepare for potential future contact. Yet amid the frenzy, Elias found himself increasingly isolated. His colleagues praised his poise under pressure, but none could grasp the depth of what had transpired on that icy plateau. To them, it was a diplomatic milestone. To him, it was profoundly personal. Sleep eluded him. Nights stretched into endless hours of restless tossing, his mind replaying fragments of their conversation. He saw her eyes in every shadow, heard her melodic voice in the wind outside his window. The memory of her vulnerability haunted him, stirring emotions he struggled to articulate. Was it admiration, compassion, or something deeper, more primal? He didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. During the day, he threw himself into work, poring over data collected during the encounter. Scientists had recorded fluctuations in atmospheric energy, shifts in gravitational fields, and inexplicable electromagnetic pulses emanating from her ship. But none of it brought him closer to understanding her. The equations and graphs felt hollow, devoid of the humanity or alienity that had defined their interaction. Frustrated, he began sketching her form in journals, attempting to capture the ephemeral quality of her presence. Each stroke of the pen revealed new details he hadn't noticed before: the way her light refracted differently depending on her mood, the subtle curvature of her translucent features, the faint hum that seemed to resonate whenever she moved. Yet no drawing could replicate the intensity of her gaze, the way it had pierced through him and left an indelible mark. His colleagues noticed the change in him. Once reserved and methodical, Elias now spoke animatedly about the encounter, his eyes alight with fervor. Some dismissed it as post-traumatic stress or the intoxication of fame, but others sensed there was more to his transformation. Dr. Meera Patel, a xenobiologist who had worked alongside him during preliminary analyses, cornered him one afternoon in the lab. "You're obsessing," she said bluntly, folding her arms across her chest. "Whatever happened out there, it's consuming you." Elias set down his pen and sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm not obsessing," he replied, though the protest sounded weak even to his own ears. "I'm trying to understand." Meera raised an eyebrow. "Understand what? That she's an alien queen? That she's leagues beyond anything we can comprehend? You can't understand someone like her, Elias. She's not human." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they echoed his own fears. Was he chasing something impossible? Had he projected human emotions onto a being who operated on an entirely different plane of existence? Yet deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Her reaction to his compliment hadn't been programmed or rehearsed. It had been genuine, raw. She had allowed herself to be seen, however briefly, and in doing so, she had revealed a side of herself that defied categorization. "I don't care if she's human or not," he said finally, his voice firm despite the turmoil within him. "She's real. Whatever she is, whoever she is, she's real. And I can't stop thinking about her." Meera studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "You're falling for her," she said quietly, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. Love. Could it be love? The idea seemed absurd, almost laughable. How could he fall for someone so alien, so removed from everything he knew? And yet, the ache in his chest, the longing that gripped him whenever he thought of her, it bore all the hallmarks of infatuation, if not something deeper. He shook his head, unwilling to accept it. "No," he muttered, though the denial lacked conviction. "It's not like that." Mira sighed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But whatever it is, you need to figure it out. Because if she comes back, and something tells me she will, you'll have to decide what you want." Her words lingered long after she left the lab. Elias stared at the sketches scattered across his desk, the outlines of her form blurring as tears welled in his eyes. He didn't know what he wanted, not really. All he knew was that she had changed him in ways he couldn't undo, and that whether she returned or not, her presence would remain etched into his soul. Weeks turned into months, and the initial fervor surrounding the alien encounter began to wane. Life on Earth resumed its usual rhythm, though subtle changes lingered beneath the surface. Governments established committees to study potential extraterrestrial communication protocols, scientists developed new theories about interstellar travel, and artists found inspiration in the mysterious visitor. Yet for Elias, time seemed to stretch endlessly, each day blending into the next without resolution. The memory of her crystalline form and luminous eyes haunted him, refusing to fade. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of amber and violet, Elias found himself drawn to the plateau where they had first met. The snow had melted, replaced by patches of resilient grass and wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. Standing there, he felt both a profound emptiness and an inexplicable sense of connection, as though the land itself remembered her presence. He closed his eyes, letting the cool air wash over him, and whispered her name aloud, though he didn't know what to call her. Queen. Stranger? Something else entirely? As if in response, the air grew still. The rustling leaves fell silent, and a peculiar warmth enveloped him, emanating not from the sun but from somewhere deeper, more fundamental. His eyes snapped open, and his breath hitched. Before him, shimmering into existence as though woven from the twilight itself, stood her ship. Its metallic surface rippled like liquid starlight, casting iridescent reflections across the landscape. For a moment, Elias thought he might be dreaming, but the weight of reality pressed heavily upon him as the vessel's surface parted, revealing her once more. She stepped out slowly, her crystalline form glowing softly in the fading light. Her eyes, those impossibly vast orbs of violet and gold, locked onto his with an intensity that made his knees weak. She looked different this time, less regal, more approachable, as though she had shed some invisible armor. Her posture was relaxed, almost hesitant, and there was a vulnerability in her gaze that hadn't been present before. "You came back," Elias breathed, his voice trembling with disbelief and joy. "I wasn't sure you would." Her lips, or what passed for lips, curved into a faint smile, the motion sending ripples of light across her translucent features. "I told you I might," she replied, her mental voice resonating warmly in his mind. "But I did not expect to feel compelled." Compelled. The word sent a shiver down his spine. Compelled by what? By him. By their unfinished conversation? By the connection they had forged in that brief, extraordinary moment? He wanted to ask, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply stood there, drinking in the sight of her, afraid that if he moved or spoke, she might vanish again. "I have thought much of our meeting," she continued, her tone contemplative. "Of your words, your humanity. They linger within me, unsettling yet illuminating." Elias swallowed hard, finding his voice after a long pause. "I've thought about you too. Constantly. About what you said, about beauty, about being seen. It stayed with me." Her eyes softened, and she took a tentative step closer, her movements fluid and deliberate. "You see me," she murmured, almost to herself. "Not as a queen, not as an alien, but as something else. Something I cannot name." He nodded, his heart pounding. That's how it should be. Everyone deserves to be seen for who they are, not just the roles they play. A flicker of emotion crossed her face, though it was difficult to interpret. Sadness, longing, perhaps both. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him feel both exposed and cherished. "And what do you see when you look at me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Everything, he wanted to say. "I see everything." But the words felt insufficient, inadequate to convey the depth of what he felt. Instead, he reached out instinctively, his hand hovering inches from her shimmering form. She didn't pull away, and after a moment's hesitation, he let his fingers graze the edge of her crystalline arm. The sensation was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Cool yet electric, as though he were touching pure energy distilled into matter. "You're extraordinary," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Beautiful, yes, but also complex. Contradictory. Human, in a way." She blinked, her luminous eyes widening slightly. "Human?" she repeated, the word carrying a note of wonder. "Is that what you believe?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," he admitted, lowering his hand. "But I do know this, whatever you are, you're more than just a queen. More than just an alien. You're you." For a moment, silence stretched between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a sound like wind chimes catching the first rays of dawn. It was musical, melodic, and utterly enchanting. Elias felt a grin spread across his face, unbidden and uncontrollable. "You amuse me," she said, her expression softening further. "No one has ever dared to speak to me thus. To strip away titles and expectations." "Maybe it's time someone did," he interrupted gently. "You said yourself that being seen is perilous. But maybe it's worth the risk." Her gaze held his, searching, probing. There was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, quickly replaced by resolve. "Perhaps," she conceded. "But risks require trust. Can you trust me, human man?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Trust wasn't something given lightly, especially not to an alien queen whose motives and origins remained shrouded in mystery. Yet as Elias looked into her glowing eyes, he realized that trust wasn't a choice. It was already there, rooted deep within him, born of the connection they had forged. "I think I already do," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Her expression softened further, and she extended a delicate, translucent hand toward him. "Then come," she said, her voice carrying a quiet urgency. "There is much I wish to show you." Elias hesitated, glancing back at the distant horizon where civilization lay. He thought of the life he'd built, the responsibilities he'd left behind. But none of it mattered in that moment. Whatever awaited him aboard her ship, whatever truths or dangers lay ahead, he knew he couldn't turn away. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, placing his hand in hers. The contact sent a surge of warmth through him, grounding him even as the world around them began to blur and shift. Together, they ascended toward the shimmering vessel, its surface rippling like water as it enveloped them in light. Inside, the ship was unlike anything Elias could have imagined. The interior defied conventional notions of space and dimension, appearing simultaneously vast and intimate. Walls seemed to breathe, pulsating with soft, bioluminescent hues that shifted in response to their presence. Strange shapes floated lazily in the air, resembling constellations suspended in gelatinous amber. The air hummed faintly, carrying a melody that resonated deep within his bones, a song without words, yet rich with emotion. She guided him gently through the labyrinthine corridors, her touch firm yet reassuring. Each step felt like crossing a threshold into another realm, one where time and distance lost all meaning. He tried to memorize every detail, knowing instinctively that this journey would reshape him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Questions bubbled up within him, but he held them back, content for now to simply absorb the wonder of it all. Finally, they arrived at what appeared to be a central chamber, a vast, domed expanse filled with cascading streams of light. At its center floated a structure unlike anything he'd ever seen, a lattice of crystalline threads, each glowing faintly with its own unique hue. The threads intertwined in intricate patterns, forming a living tapestry that seemed to pulse with energy. "This is my sanctuary," she explained, her mental voice reverberating softly around them. "Here, I reflect. Here, I remember." Elias approached cautiously, his eyes wide with awe. As he drew closer, he noticed something extraordinary. The threads began to shift, rearranging themselves in response to his presence. Images flickered within the lattice. Scenes of distant worlds, civilizations rising and falling, moments of triumph and sorrow. It was as though the structure contained the collective memory of her people, a repository of their history and essence. "This is incredible," he murmured, reaching out instinctively toward the nearest thread. She stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. "Be careful," she warned, her tone tinged with both caution and affection. "These memories are fragile. They hold truths that may overwhelm you." He nodded, withdrawing his hand reluctantly. "What is this place called?" She hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "We call it the Nexus. It is where we preserve what we are, and where we dream of what we might become." Her explanation sent a shiver down his spine. The Nexus wasn't just a repository. It was a crucible, a place where identity and possibility converged. He turned to her, his gaze filled with wonder and reverence. "You've shown me so much already. Why bring me here?" Her luminous eyes softened, and she stepped closer, her form glowing faintly in the ambient light. "Because I wish to share more than memories with you," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made his heart ache. "I wish to share myself." The declaration left him speechless. Share herself? What did that mean? Was she offering him access to her thoughts, her emotions, her very soul? The implications were staggering, almost too immense to comprehend. "How?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. She reached out, placing her hand gently against his chest, over his heart. The contact sent a wave of warmth coursing through him, filling him with a sense of peace and clarity he hadn't known he needed. "Through connection," she replied. "Through trust." Before he could respond, the room around them began to dissolve, melting away like frost under sunlight. The threads of the Nexus unraveled, weaving themselves into a new pattern, one that included him. Elias felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing him deeper into the tapestry of light. Panic fluttered at the edges of his consciousness, but her presence anchored him, calming his fears. "Trust me," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind as the world shifted around them. And then, everything went white. When Elias regained awareness, he found himself adrift in a sea of sensations unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Sounds, scents, emotions, all flooded his senses simultaneously, overwhelming yet strangely harmonious. He realized he was no longer standing in the Nexus. Instead, he existed within it, his consciousness intertwined with the luminous threads that pulsed around him. Each filament carried fragments of her memories, her thoughts, her essence, and now, inexplicably, they resonated with his own. The first memory that surfaced was vivid and immediate, the birth of a star. He felt its fiery genesis deep within his core, the explosive release of energy igniting life across untold systems. Through her eyes, or rather, through her perception, he witnessed galaxies spiraling into existence, their celestial dances choreographed by forces beyond comprehension. Joy surged through him, uncontainable and pure, as if he were celebrating creation itself. Then came darker visions. Wars fought not with weapons but with ideologies, civilizations crumbling under the weight of their own hubris. Despair washed over him, sharp and biting, yet tempered by resilience. He saw her kind grappling with loss, mourning the extinction of cultures they had once nurtured, striving to rebuild amidst the ruins. These memories weren't hers alone. They belonged to her people, shared and preserved within the Nexus. Yet they felt personal, as though she carried the weight of every triumph and tragedy personally. Amidst these grand narratives, quieter moments emerged. A child laughing under twin suns, her laughter ringing like bells. An elder teaching younger generations the art of weaving stories into songs. The tender embrace of two beings exchanging vows beneath a canopy of bioluminescent trees. These glimpses of everyday life grounded him, reminding him that even gods, or those akin to gods, cherished simplicity and connection. Throughout this torrent of experience, her presence remained constant, guiding him, anchoring him. Her thoughts intertwined with his, creating a symphony of understanding. He sensed her curiosity about humanity, her fascination with their capacity for contradiction, for destruction and creation, cruelty and compassion. She marveled at their ability to find beauty in imperfection, to create art from chaos. Yet there was sadness too. Sadness for the divisions among humans, the mistrust and fear that fractured their unity. She showed him glimpses of Earth's conflicts, not to judge but to understand. In turn, Elias shared his own memories, childhood dreams scribbled in notebooks, friendships forged and lost, the quiet solace of libraries where knowledge lived eternal. He revealed his hopes and fears, his doubts about whether humanity deserved salvation or redemption. Their exchange transcended language, transcended thought itself. It was raw, unfiltered communion, a merging of souls that defied description. Time ceased to exist. There was only the now, infinite and eternal. Elias felt himself expanding, becoming more than he had ever been, while simultaneously shrinking to the smallest, most authentic version of himself. He understood then that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was strength. To be seen fully, without pretense or defense, was the ultimate act of courage. As the flow of memories ebbed, leaving him awash in a serene stillness, he became aware of her voice again, gentle and reverent. "Now you see," she said, her words resonating within the depths of his being. "Now you understand." Tears streamed down his face, though he couldn't tell if they were his or hers, or perhaps both. Understanding wasn't enough. It never would be. But it was a start, a foundation upon which something greater could be built. He reached out, not physically, but with his mind, his spirit, and found her waiting, ready to meet him halfway. Together, suspended in the nexus, they began to weave a new thread, one that bound their worlds together. It glowed brightly, pulsating with promise, and Elias knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it as one.